You may be wondering why we've asked you all here today.
Are you ready to go? All right.
All right.
So I think we'll get started. I'm Mark Greene, the director of Trinity Spiritual Center. I think I know most of you. So, and for all of you online, we have another crowd online. So just want to welcome everybody today and point out the bathrooms, which is the first order of business in case anybody needs a bathroom. They're on opposite sides of the hall, and there's a bathroom around the corner if we end up having a traffic jam at some point. The exits are everywhere, as you can see, in case we need them. Again, as you came in and then out this way as well. So with that, I think go ahead and get started with the actual formal part of the program. And I can't tell you how excited I am to actually be able to engage in this conversation with Mark Greene, whom I first got to know now a couple years ago or so, when I submitted a series of essays to the Goodman Project. To my great surprise, they were accepted. And I found as I was writing those essays that I kept referring a lot back to Mark's writing and some of his ideas that, as it turned out, we had a lot of common ground between us. Not only in terms of the writing and the ways in which we are experiencing the challenges that men today encounter, but we also happen to be fellow Texans, which is another sort of common point between us that might explain a lot.
Yeah, maybe.
So we're going to follow a slightly different format than we have in other occasions. I think this is now the 10th presentation that we've done at the center, going all the way back over a year now. And we're going to today have a brief presentation of this construct, the Manbox, which is such a useful framework for understanding the challenges that men are encountering and the way we roll. And Mark's going to take us through an explanation of that construct and show how it can help organize our thinking about what's going on today. And then after we have that little bit, he and I are going to model an exercise that is often used in men's work. And then we're going to open up to questions as we go along today. And unlike other settings, we have had questions at the end. But I'll get us started with a bunch of questions that I'd love to make sure that we cover. But as we get deeper into the conversation today, we'll be handing around mics. And if you're so inclined, feel free to grab a mic and lob a question at us, and we'll try to give you an answer or evade the answer.
That's right, or duck out.
So I think if that's good enough for now, we'll go ahead and start the video.
Yeah,
Mark.
Let's begin with a video.
We are human beings, and as human beings, we have relationships, and that's how we develop, and that's how we grow, and that's what we want most in our lives, is to have positive and high-quality relationships. And what happens, of course, is the culture gets in the way.
What we used to call the traditional ideology of masculinity is a recipe for early stress-related diseases, unhappiness, and violence.
The secret of men, the conversations that do not take place among men, have to do with shame. And of course, that is the pressure also. Am I man enough? Am I performing enough? Am I successful enough? Am I providing enough?
Why are men in this country, especially middle-aged men, despairing? Why is it that the suicide rate has increased for them? Why is it that there's so much dysfunction and violence? I mean, it has to be, to my mind, the mismatch between these utterly unrealizable ideals and our actual lives.
Who shames boys? History, tradition, religion, parents, teachers, coaches, other girls, other boys. Even if you have never ever told your boy, don't cry, it doesn't take long for them to pick that up.
The simple message that to be a man means you have to be emotionless. I mean, you could be angry possibly, but emotionless in the sense of invulnerable is traumatic, right? And that leads to essentially everything else.
I think it's a mistake to think that men and boys are not naturally empathic. I have a very optimistic view of this. I mean, you surely know this if you've ever watched a 2 or 3 year old boy, you know, deal with a wounded bird. You see empathy, you see compassion. Somewhere we have to beat that out of them. Somehow we have to destroy that.
Boys are really pressured to display a lot of the, quote unquote, masculine characteristics, including physical toughness, kind of this indifference or emotional stoicism, and also a projected self-sufficiency. So really being taught not to show that they need or desire relationships. That really puts them in a difficult position of not being able to share themselves with other people, not being able to express a full range of their thoughts and feelings and desires, and ultimately really feeling a sense of isolation, that feeling of lack of social connectedness, lack of other people's acceptance and support has been linked to depression and suicide and or violence against other people. And I think that those feelings of isolation can really be detrimental both for the boys as individuals and to the people around them.
We live in a culture that tells our sons to hide their emotions. We live in a culture that tells our daughters only certain kinds of emotions should be expressed. It is through the expression of emotions that we connect in relationship to others. In fact, emotions are born in those relational spaces between people. So if we tell our children, don't express emotions, what we're basically doing is limiting their capacity to form relationships.
That sort of message that the boys tell us, as well as girls tell us, also is confirmed in the neuroscience and all sorts of evolutionary anthropology, that we are born naturally relational human beings. That's a natural state of how we are as humans. Charles Darwin even said the reason why we've thrived as a species is because of our social nature. Our problems are we live in a culture that defines not only manhood but also maturity in ways that actually disconnect us from our relationships.
I forgot one thing that I want to share, if I could.
Please.
Yeah. I forgot to say who Mark is. Mark has been writing on men's issues now for over 10 years, 15 years, a long time. And has been the senior editor of the Good Men Project, which if you don't know that platform, I highly recommend it. It's a place that gives voice to the stories of men. And it's a wonderful space to go and check out all the different ways in which men are sharing their experience, and with women as well. And in addition to that, Mark has launched this amazing podcast, Remaking Manhood, that has taken on the responsibility of interviewing some of the men and women who are most active in the men's movement that is going on right now. And in addition, he has a wonderful life partner, Saliha Bava, who is every bit Mark's equal or more, and has her own body of work that is contributing to our understanding of the ways in which we can imagine that we might eventually see a shift in the culture of masculinity in this country. And for all those reasons, I'm really very happy to have you here, Mark.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all of you for coming today, and I just want to set the focus of the conversation with a simple statement. The conversation about masculinity is a conversation about disconnection. It's about the ways in which our larger culture of masculinity for generations has taught boys and men to perform a version of masculinity which is inherently individualizing and isolating and disconnecting. And there was a guy named Paul Kivel in the early 1980s who went into high schools in the Bay Area as part of an initiative to try and understand why there was so much violence against women in that community. And he ended up asking boys, what are the rules for being a man? And the answers he got back were pretty straightforward. And we have a slide here, I believe, with a list of, what most of those rules were that he came across. And the first and top rule of this so-called man box, he called it the act like a man box. And he literally drew a box up on the blackboard in these high schools and wrote the rules in. And whenever a boy got outside the boundaries of that box, of those sets of rules, they would be policed and bullied by other boys to get back into that sort of narrow performance of masculinity. But the first and foremost rule of the man box was don't show your emotions. And we have generations of masculinity, we have media, we have parenting styles, we have all these different reinforcements of that idea that if you're having an emotional moment, hide it. And it begins in infancy for boys. They fall down, scrape their knee on the playground at age 3 or 4 and start crying. The message to them is, okay, shake it off, brush it off, you're all right, you're okay. And if they fail to stop crying, maybe their cohort, maybe their parent will say, man up, be a man. Or they might say, what are you, a sissy? What are you, a girl? And in this way, they're sort of telling that kid that this expression, this most extreme expression of emotion, which is crying, isn't really appropriate for boys. And the degree to which that same message is applied to dozens of other possible versions of emotional expression, joy, the need for connection, confusion, doubt, any of these ideas that might appear as an emotional expression, boys are taught, let's not show that. And the end result of that single prohibition, as Niobe Way says, when you tell boys that you're supposed to pretend you are not emotional, i.e. invulnerable, is traumatizing. And everything else that men struggle with into adulthood is born out of that original repeating trauma to don't show us what's going on for you. The rest of the rules of the man box include things like be a breadwinner, not a caregiver, be heterosexual, not homosexual, be tough, never ask for help. And these are all fairly well understood by most of the men in the room. We all sort of got those messages at one time or another. Another one of the rules of the man box that a lot of folks kind of say, wait a minute, whoa, I never got taught that one, is have control over women and girls. But we have a bit of data here from Promundo on the next slide that kind of speaks to that issue. And Promundo has been doing studies on masculinity, and they have a beautiful report online that you can download. It's just called The Man Box. And they've been doing studies on masculinity in Mexico, the United States, and Great Britain since the late 1990s. And in a study published in 2017, they included this question, which I'm going to paraphrase, is something to the effect of if you're a man who's in a relationship with a woman, you have the right to know where she is at all times. That's just a yes or no question they asked men. And if you think we don't have a general cultural message to men in America that's a man's right to know where his woman is at all times, then you'd be surprised to know the actual percentage of men who said yes to that question. 46%. And this is in 2017. So what else is interesting about the data they reveal is that 56% of men said that that's the message they got, that they were taught that message. So you can see that the number of boys and men who were taught that, a fairly high number of them adopted that belief system. The the challenge that we face with Manbox culture, with this set of rules that Paul Kivel originally called the Act Like a Man Box and Tony Porter later shortened to the Man Box, is that it defines a version of masculinity that is about doing. When you talk about being a breadwinner, when you talk about making a lot of money, when you talk about having a lot of sex, when you talk about having control over women and girls, all of these things are measures of what a man does, not who a man is. And accordingly, a lot of us lived our lives, I certainly did, on this sort of model of don't show your fears, your anxiety, your discomfort, your worry. Show what you're doing to prove that you are winning at this game of masculinity. So I think for many of us, we come to be 20, 25 years old, and we get into this sort of interesting game for men, which is to, hey, look at me, I got a pretty good job. Now, ooh, got a mortgage. Hey, I've got a wife. I'm raising a family. You keep doing these markers over and over again, but they're all about doing. And they have given rise more recently to a culture of masculinity that's about, how much sex can you have? And of course, can you drink all your buddies under the table? And if you do have any conversations with your friends, keep it very surface level, make it about cars or money or sex or whatever. Don't talk about anything deep. And the end result is, for a lot of men, we look up at age 45 or 50, and we realize that we're living a relatively isolated life. We may have a marriage, we may have some kids, we may have some guys at the gym, but if we change the gym, we just drop those friendships and pick up the ones at the next gym because they're all pretty much the same, right? And the end result is a lot of men find themselves in crisis later in life because when they run into the inevitable aging out of the man box, the rules for being a man, they're not, their pickup lines aren't working that well anymore. They may have difficulty continuing to advance in their work, or they may lose their job. They may have a health issue. They may run into their second divorce, me. You at some point begin to realize that you have no community to resource you in terms of the challenges you're facing as a man. And this is ultimately the problem with a culture of masculinity that's about doing. It's a hamster wheel. Just go and go and go until you can't do it anymore, and then you get shunted to the side and the younger men come along. But what's really important about this culture of masculinity, and I think it informs many of the problems we have with women in terms of the Me Too movement, in terms of how we treat women, how we view women, is that beginning at this very early age, this little boy on the playground that scrapes his knee and starts crying and gets asked, what are you, a girl? What are you, a sissy? Sometimes he'll be asked, what are you, gay? Is that we have boys who are trained out of emotional expression very specifically through the denigration of the feminine. So we take half of the capacities that are normally associated with being human, not male or female, but human, which in the case of boys the thing that we strip away from boys are empathy, the emotional expression, interest in connection across difference, this sort of flexible caregiving aspects that are very common to young boys. We take that half of being human and we deny it to boys. And previously, we're getting a little better about this, but we take the other half of being human, which is to be tough, to be assertive, to be a leader, to hang in there, and we strip that away from girls. And we still see it playing out in the context of women as leaders, when we often police women's leadership very carefully. Oh, you're being a little too assertive, you're being a little not assertive enough, you're being this, you're being that. It's a very narrow range. In fact, it can't actually be done successfully. So we still deny women leadership, we still deny boys and men empathy, and in that moment, when we train boys out of those so-called feminine aspects, wrongly gendered feminine aspects, we denigrate the feminine. And if you're a boy growing up in America during the time I was, you know that this denigration of the feminine, what are you, a sissy, what are you, a girl, what are you, gay, didn't happen weekly or even daily. It happened hourly, over and over and over and over again. And the end result is we have boys who both shut themselves down from authentic expression and connection, trying to perform masculinity in this very narrow range of the man box, And we have generations of boys who come out of that process thinking that girls and women are less. That as long as I am not that, I'm better. And here's the downside. Once you teach a young man that the fact that he's a boy makes him better than everyone else, instead of a lesson more like, don't make yourself feel better by putting other people down, that would be the right lesson to teach. Instead, we teach boys they're better than girls. It doesn't take much to teach them that they're better than BIPOC, or better than LGBTQI people, or better than immigrants, or better than people of a different religion. So we have this slippery slope where we disconnect boys from community, from the emotional expression of who they are authentically, and then move them into this hierarchical, domination-based construct of masculinity, okay? So boys and men learn very quickly that in that world, who they are authentically isn't relevant, and that if they want to express in ways that will validate that masculine construct, they have to do it by dominating the people around them. They have to be hard-charging, winning, competitive, tough, stoic, all of these things. That's Manbox culture, and that is why Manbox culture has led to generations of the denigration of women. So, that being said, most of the men in this room either know men or in their own lives can say honestly, well, I'm not like that, or I didn't do it that way, or I've always been a rebel. Mark, you have some stories along those lines where you gave pushback to that construct. But when we have 46% of men in America answering yes to that question, that they should know where their girlfriend is at all times, but wouldn't necessarily want to be known where they are at all times, then we still have a huge challenge with our culture of masculinity. And that's what I think the problem statement is for today. And this is what our sons, our young sons, when we talk about raising boys in a healthy way, we're talking about going up against that construct, where we say instead to our young sons, show me who you are authentically, tell me what's going on for you, bring your whole self, which, by the way, these days we're inviting people to do in corporations. We've come to understand that that's how you get a fully involved, engaged, excited person on your team in an organization. We need to be inviting our sons into that early, and our daughters, because there is a version of this that also affects our daughters. So with that, Mark, that's my, sort of statement on the Manbox and on the culture of masculinity that drives a lot of what we believe or what we've had to try and fix about our own performances of masculinity now that we're reaching the age that you and I are.
Yeah. So I would be really interested in better understanding how this culture gets instilled in young boys at an early age. I know that there's a body of research that Judy Chu is a big exponent of, and I would love to hear you kind of take us through how this gets started really early on.
So the research, two of the women you saw in the video, Judy Chu and Niobe Wei, have, between the two of them, provided some really powerful research in terms of the socialization of young boys. Judy Chu went into a pre-K class. She has a book called When Boys Become Boys. And she went into a pre-K class and spent 2 years with that cohort of boys and girls, studying exactly what happened developmentally for those young men. And what she discovered is that boys at that age are already hiding their emotional acuity, that is, their ability to read and respond to emotional cues in other people. And they also are beginning to take on the sort of stoic performance of masculinity. I don't care, it's all cool. That the culture begins to force on them. And she tells a story of a 4-year-old boy who comes up to her. She had been there for a number of months, and it's sort of, I'm reminded of Jane Goodall and the chimpanzees, right? Like, she was there long enough that they began to trust her, and they'd come up and check her out and talk to her. And then And one little boy came up to her and he said, Miss Chu, I'm friends with all the girls, but don't tell Mike, the head of the boys club, because if he finds out I'm friends with all the girls, he'll kick me out of the club and I won't have a club anymore. Now, it's bad enough that this young man is already being kept from being in ongoing dialogue with the girls who represent, a connection across difference. But what's far more concerning for us is to understand that this young man is already disengaging with authentic parts of himself in order to conform to what the leader of his cohort is suggesting to him is the right way to be a young man. And what Judy talked to us about in our podcast was that the deep tragedy of young boys in this culture is that all they want is connection. They want to be part of their cohort, they want to be in connection, they want to belong, and they want it very, very much. And what they're being told is, oh yeah, you can belong, you can be part of the cohort, and here's the rules of the club. And the rules of the club create disconnection. And by the time they figure out, oh, I'm in a club, but the club won't let me be who I authentically am, it's typically too late. They're already far into that performance. And so the long and short of it is, Judy Chu shows us pre-K, this influence is already happening. And then we go to the work of Niobe Way, and she wrote a book called Deep Secrets. She's at NYU, and she did a significant body of research over more than a decade, where she went to boys in early adolescence, and she said, what does your best friend mean to you? And those boys would say, universally, they'd say, I love my best friend. They'd use the word love. And then the other thing they all said was, without my best friend, I would go crazy. Go forward 4 years into late adolescence, she goes back and interviews the same boys. And they say, well, yeah, my best friend Mike, he's around the corner, but I don't see him that much anymore. He's a great basketball player, no homo. They throw that in to make absolutely sure that if they say anything kind about their earlier friendship, that it's not homosexual in any way, shape, or form. Another boy says, yeah, that friendship, it's kind of on a crossfade. It's kind of fading out. And when she did some additional looking at the reasons behind this, what she discovered is that these boys are not interested in who they authentically are. They are desperate to prove what they are not, which is little kids, girly, or gay. So in late adolescence, they disengage from these friendships that they previously said, without which I would go crazy, and their suicide numbers become 4 times that of girls their age. So what we have is a culture bearing down on boys from a very early age, teaching them that every aspect of their natural relational capacity to form and care for friendships is girly, gay, or an expression of being a little kid. And then that pressure just stays in place until they finally let go of those connections. And by the way, it is in late adolescence that these boys are then encouraged to, well, if you want any kind of compassion, connection, get a girlfriend. And they're sent over toward a young lady who is in no way, shape, or form ready to provide that level of connection, to replace all of the other possible social relationships and friendships that these boys have relied on. So we get this whole problem of women's unearned emotional labor beginning at that early stage, and these boys are basically told that's the only source for, and God help you if you happen to be a gay boy, because then you're totally out of luck, right? This moves forward into a lot of health research and a lot of other information later in life, where we've come to understand that men who do not have a circle of close, intimate friendships with other men face dramatically higher health risks than men who do have a circle of friends. And I'm not talking about men who sit around and have a few beers for a couple of hours and talk about sports or whatever. I'm talking about men who actually share what's going on for them in their lives. But if you do not have that resource, and there's reams of research about this, then what you're looking at is dramatically higher likelihood of heart disease, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, diabetes, depression, a lot of other stuff. So we see the arc of these guys who have stayed fairly busy playing the game, and then they start to age out of being able to do the man box, and they run headlong into these statistics that say if you don't have a circle of friends, intimate, close men you can relate to and care about you, then you run into these health numbers. So it's an ugly picture, and our job as parents is to try and intercede early with boys and girls in terms of helping them grow their relational intelligence, their ability to center and care for relationships, which is antithetical to what we as men in the man box are taught. We're taught to center our roles, our power, our status, and in this hierarchical system, we need to learn to dominate those around us or we'll lose status, and that increases the number of men who can dominate us. So it's a survival game where we keep trying to work our way up by being more and more dominant. And all of us know that you can't have a healthy, meaningful friendship with someone who's dominating you or someone you're dominating. So the long and short of it is we can either intercede when boys are very young, or we're going to have to fix what's broken in men who are reaching that point where the game isn't working for them anymore.
So one of the things we haven't yet talked about that I think it might be useful to dig into a little is the way in which this culture is perpetuated, and the microaggressions that are allowed between men to enforce or police conformity to the edicts of the man box.
Right.
Why don't we go there for a second and talk about that?
I think most boys' friendships are built around joking about each other's failings, right?
Yeah.
And when we talk about how friends police each other, what they're actually doing in small cohorts of boys is they're setting the pecking order. And whoever gets to make fun of who for what gets to define how that pecking order works, and then everybody, and you see men, you walk into a bar and meet a friend of yours and three of his friends, and pretty quickly you make fun of each other's sports teams, and you point out somebody's socks, and you've figured out the pecking order, right? And from that point forward, that pecking order is adhered to. So it's about reinforcing the hierarchy, both in close-in peer groups where you're relatively comfortable with each other, out to and including acts of violence against people who are too far outside the man box. And we do that, just like the little microaggressions, we do those larger acts of violence against people outside the box as a way to prove our conformity and to hold our position in the hierarchy.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things that I've noticed is that, and not to put too much weight on it, but I think that oftentimes the guys who are guilty of the mass shootings are at the very, very, very bottom of the hierarchy. Mm-hmm. So they've been taking the brunt of this for a long time, and then they're acting out against others at the bottom of the hierarchy. So, I mean, this is a very real phenomenon that has an enormous impact on all of us, no matter where we are in our stage of life even. I mean, I think that one of the more interesting things is what happens to men. We talked about this a little bit with Ashton Applewhite last spring, as you might remember, about the way in which men are at risk, really, as we age out of the workforce and have difficult time with the transitions that occur. Because oftentimes we're not just losing our jobs, but we are losing our identity, we're losing our networks.
You're also losing your leverage over your family, over perhaps the women in your life who you have always brought home the paycheck to. And that's one of the reasons why be a breadwinner, not a caregiver, is such a strong edict in the man box. Because if you're bringing home the paycheck, then you have a lot of control over what happens in the home. And it's an old model. You know, when men first went onto the factory floor in the Industrial Revolution, they basically made a deal with the devil, which is, you can treat me how you want in this factory, and I can treat everybody in my home the way I want to. And it led to lives for women who at that time were not allowed to work, were not allowed to get educations, were not allowed to vote. It led to lives for women which were basically whether you got lucky or not with the man in your home. And that was a brutal level of imbalance, but they knew that if that paycheck didn't come home, they'd be out on the street pretty quickly, and their children would be at risk and everything else. So come forward into the modern era, women have fought tooth and nail to get the rights ultimately to economic independence via the vote, via education, via work, via all these things. But you still see constant pressure on women challenging their right to come into those spaces, both in terms of how women are treated in the workplace, the kinds of microaggressions that go on still to this day in the working world, the degree to which we hold women leaders accountable in a very different and imbalanced way than we do male leaders, all of that stuff. So we have this constant belief among men that women reaching true equity is a threat to our comfort level or our ability to have control. And it's that need for control all the time which speaks to the trauma that boys deal with early on. Boys aren't born with a need to control those around them. They're born with a need to protect themselves. And when they're hit with trauma over and over again by a dominance-based masculinity, they end up adopting control as the only way to try to find safety. So it's a bad system, and I think it's beginning to fall apart because of all, and remember, when you talk about a hierarchy of dominance, men are dominating each other, but everyone else is below that.
Yeah.
So if you're having a bad day, and you've been dominated by a few men and you want to model your dominance, just go dish it out to a woman or a gay man or a person of color or an immigrant. And we see that playing out all the time. Understand that in Manbox culture, all of us are hiding something authentic to ourselves that didn't fit in. If you're a gay man born in America, especially in the 40s or 50s, you had to hide your sexual identity, which is a massive piece of who those men were at that time. And the greater the scale of what you're hiding, for some men, traditional masculinity, as it's called, Manbox masculinity, is a partial fit. So they're a little more comfortable in that space. But if you're hiding something significant all your life and trying to align yourself with Manbox culture, the scale of that and the distance it stretches you is what defines the anxiety that you live with every day. And most men are hiding something. We hide little things, we hide big things, we hide aspects of ourselves. In a culture which says have control over women and girls, we hide the kindnesses we do for our wives. Oh man, you're so whipped. We hide our own gentle natures. So all of the things that we're hiding in order to fit into that bullying hierarchy create immense anxiety for us that we then, when it gets to be too much, we vent out sideways at someone below us on the hierarchy.
Yeah, we were definitely talking about that earlier today, about the amount of anger that men experience and express. And, you know, guilty as charged. I find myself constantly becoming a tower of rage. And it's been a real issue because, you know, I like to think that I'm a good guy and I'm trying my best and all that. And yet, just being sort of in this situation creates these stresses that, you know, and you do your best to deal with it and then all of a sudden, or manage it, and then all of a sudden it just erupts out of you.
Right.
As a, you know.
So we are carrying ongoing anxiety, we're carrying ongoing stress, which basically in dominance-based masculine culture, you're threat tracking all the time. You're tracking all the men around you. Is anybody going to notice that I didn't do that quite the way I should? Is this guy going to call me out for this or this or this or this? Maybe I should call someone else first, just to get a little dominance here in this circle, back a few people off. So we're constantly tracking threats. We're constantly tracking our own internal doubts. And once you've existed in a culture which corrects you and checks you enough times about your masculinity, you develop what's called the cop in the head. And then you don't even need people to call you out. You're calling yourself out all the time. Man, why am I so weak? Man, why didn't I do something different? Why didn't I just beat that guy's ass? Why, you know, all these expressions of dominance we keep policing ourselves about internally. That's why boys and men have these fantasies about kicking everybody's ass, and this is why some boys, after they're abused long enough, commit acts of mass violence. It's all about venting out this incredible stress because we cannot be who we are authentically. When you talk about anger, I had someone very near to me tell someone I was going to marry years ago, he's very angry. And I was a little insulted by that, but I'm not angry. And a few years later, I realized I'm angry all the damn time. And where's that coming from? And how is it that we can, in our performance of masculinity, become so disconnected from those aspects of ourselves that we hid away, from those aspects of ourselves that don't fit the narrative, that we no longer are even conscious of them, that they're automatic, that they burst out of us, that we always have an excuse to make for it, all of these things. Well, it comes from that process by which we train boys out of showing up as their whole selves, authentically, right? Well, you're not having that feeling.
No. I think there's
Mark,
also...
you're not having that feeling.
Yeah.
Don't tell me about that feeling.
Right.
I don't want to hear about that feeling.
I can tell you all about it. No, I think there's another piece of this that we haven't quite yet touched on, which is that it's not just the self-policing, but it's also not fully living into our authentic identities. And by that what I mean that we know that there are certain things about ourselves that is not going to get us any brownie points, but they're perhaps even fundamental to who we are, and yet we will hide those aspects. I mean, one of the things that just an example is that I've been, a writer my entire life on these issues. I have not really shared that with anyone because it was not acceptable for me to be a guy talking about this kind of stuff. And it was only in the last couple of years when I'm like, oh, why just let it loose finally? I can't even begin to tell you what a relief it was. It was like a liberation to finally admit that I was having these experiences and that I needed to actually say something about it to somebody. So and that's just one tiny example of a million things that I could list of things that I just haven't chosen to share. And it's not a healthy way of living life, going through life, sort of showing up every day at 10% of yourself.
Yeah.
I mean,
so let me.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
We're both Marks.
Yeah, that's right. Good luck.
I'll tell you exactly what happened to me that flipped the switch. I was actually asked to attend a conference out in Ojai of 100 men right after Me Too, because there was just a great deal of concern that something had to be done, and that men finally needed to own up and acknowledge to the negative impacts that we were having on women. And the construction of the conference was actually Women Teach Men. So they brought in a number of high-powered women who spent a couple of days with us, helping us better understand our negative impacts. And And it was a really interesting reversal of the power paradigm, because typically you go to these conferences and it's men up on the stage. So I happened to be in a breakout group with a young man, 25, so I think maybe I was the oldest at the conference and he was the youngest. I was talking in the group about some of the issues, and he listened intently, and then at the end he said, you know, you've obviously thought a lot about this, haven't you? And I had to admit that, yes, it had been a lifetime of wrestling with these issues. And he said, and you've written about it too, haven't you? And I said yes, and he said, well, can you send me some of your writing? And I said yes and sent it to him. And the next day he came to me and he said, you have got to start sharing this stuff, because this is exactly what men need to be talking about. It's exactly what guys my age need. So I found myself at the end of the conference standing up in a circle and swearing that I would. And that was kind of the switch for me. Like, I can no longer hide. I really need to be doing this work. So.
How interesting that it came out of a conversation with other men. I do something called men's work with an organization called the Mankind Project. And it's not the only organization that does that kind of work, and there are many different ways that men can engage the questions that we do in that organization. But one of the things that we invite men to do in men's work is something called a check-in. It's a fairly simple step, but in the moment that you do it, you break the Manbox in several fundamental ways. But I'm going to just model a check-in, and Mark's going to do one as well. And if anybody else would like to take a shot at it from the audience, you're welcome to do so. We'll bring you a microphone and you can do it. Just be aware that your entire family is watching on this stream. So, but when I do a check-in, this is what I do. I say, well, I'm excited. I'm excited to be in a conversation. Underneath that, I have some tension about, how I'm going to go forward through this process and make people feel involved and engaged. Underneath that, I have this freaking river of sadness because we lost someone very dear to me and my family about 3 weeks ago, which has impacted everyone in my circle, in my home, and which has reminded me of the death of my father in 2015, which I was present for, and which I realized I spoke about the events of caring for him in the last weeks of his life. And anyone who's cared for someone who's dying understands the degree of the physical nature of that. But I never wept that story. And here we are talking about crying again, which just curdles a lot of people's milk. I don't know why when we talk about men being emotional, we have to talk about crying. But in the case of grief, that's the way you move it out. I called my friend Boyson 6 days ago, and we did a FaceTime, and I wept that story, the details of my father's last days, both his beautiful ability to connect even just, 2 days before he died, but also his shame and grief at having to put this burden on other people to take care of him through this process. So that's my check-in. I got this river flowing, which I'm mindful of, and which on one level I'm grateful for, and the other level I'm exhausted by. And then I have the joy and excitement of this conversation.
So my check-in, I think what I'm feeling in this moment is fear borderlining on terror. Because
I love that. Freaking love that.
Because these kinds of conversations are not natural for me. I grew up in a very, very private family. And we would have conversations like this, perhaps, amongst ourselves, but we would never have it outside the family. And, oh God, my heart is racing. And I'm married into a family that is even more private than mine. And I find myself in a room with people that I know and I'm going to have to face afterwards, saying things, revealing things that I don't believe I would have done otherwise. So I'm feeling very, like a little bit naked, and hoping that it goes well here, because that this is a helpful experience for everybody, and for me.
Thank you for sharing that, Mark. You're not alone in those feelings. I want to just note something that you witnessed in those moments, and that is that Mark and I are not simply expressing our emotions, we are moving emotion back and forth between us. And it is in that process of co-creating our emotions, both in terms of supporting each other, but also deeply appreciating knowing what's going on for each other, that moves us out of the Manbox construct and into a much more lateral, connecting version of masculinity, a masculinity of connection, a healthy masculinity of connection, where I see Mark, I see some of you in a way which later I'll feel like I know that man, and if I need his help, I know he'll understand. I know he'll understand why I need that help.
Right.
And that's the thing I believe that these young boys in Niobe Way's books knew and understood. And that's what gets stripped away from us in this competitive hierarchical masculinity that we have to pass through if we're to be considered successful men. That said, how much time in are we at this point? Because
we're about an hour in.
I want to move to solution statements,
yeah,
right?
Definitely. Let's move that way. And also we need to open up the floor to questions, because we did what we said we weren't going to do, which is talk all the time.
Aren't we good at talking all the time?
Men are. I swear.
Really, let's just take a moment. If anyone in the group wants to just do a check-in and talk about what's going on for them during this conversation, or if you have a question for us, please, we'll take a moment for that. There may not be,
I would just wanted to make a comment. After, Mark, you shared that lovely story about crying to your friend Boyson on the phone, he wrote in the chat, "Love you, Mark, I'm here for you." And it made me almost cry, because, it's rare to see
Boyson.
that expression of emotion between men. And so easily for him to say, "I love you."
Yeah, he's good at that. He's good. He's very good.
So I asked him if I could share it. He didn't answer, but I took the liberty anyway.
Thank you.
So hi everyone. This is going to be a little bit of a tough thing to say because my husband's sitting right next to me. So my best friends and I, since we were 14, just all turned 60. And we celebrate our birthdays in a big way. But what has become a theme for us, we are all happily married, and that is wonderful. That is wonderful. But what makes us very unhappy is that our husbands often act angry and ticked off and cannot tell us what is going on, and we have to figure it out. And it's really hard.
Yeah.
And sometimes we say, "I just wish he would tell me what is going on," instead of yelling at me about the fact that I lost the keys. And that's what I'm getting from this, and taking a big risk is my check-in, because my husband's sitting next to me, but he's a good guy, so he'll listen. And
A
that's
shout out to him.
That's all I wanted to share.
Yeah.
He is. He's reading your book. Anyway, I don't want to hog the mic.
Thank you. She's my sister-in-law, that's why she called me sweet.
We're all family here.
Is this on?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi. Mark Greene, first of all, thank you very much for being here and for opening this dialogue. I can do a little bit of a check-in first, and then I'd like to speak to your comments. So part of my check-in right now is, for years, since probably, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago, with the run for the last presidential election before this, and leading up to that, the 2-3 years that was going on, right? So you've got like late 14 into 16 or something. What I experienced as a man in the United States was incredibly disappointing to me, on practically every level. And the moment that stands out for me was watching the former president physically mock a handicapped journalist. And to hear tens of thousands of people cheer for that, for me, was the epitome of simultaneously fury and rage, and also the most profound sadness and feeling like we have just slipped back 1,000 years in terms of our humanity, or lack thereof. And to hear you earlier speak to the part of boys that get stripped away, to see that acted out now in reflection, and to not only see it acted out, but see it supported en masse, if you will. That is one river, if you will, right? That just doesn't go away, because I know it's right there and it's going to come again.
Yeah.
In some form or another. It doesn't, you know. So that's one river that's there all the time. It just doesn't go away.
Yeah, for me too.
Yeah. So that's very universal, and it's nice to be able to say that to you, right, man and man sitting here in this space. The other river is kind of happy that this conversation is public. It's like, oh, finally, right? And I know I see some of this changing. I taught high school for 10 years, so I was very much on the front line in a big urban high school, where, you know, boys, you know, they beat each other up, you know, and yet now, that being earlier in my professional life, it's nice to think that maybe some of that is changing.
It is.
The other thing that I find interesting now is our love of fighting in the United States, with the advent of the UFC becoming so incredibly popular over the past 25 years, right? The ultimate fighting, where you put men in a cage and they fight. When I first saw that, I was appalled, but now it seems like, you know, everybody loves it. Those guys are allowed to cry, but only after they've beaten the crap out of another man. It seems like, although people might say, guys can cry today, they can't unless they earn it in that very traditionally masculine way.
I love that. That's a great observation.
And you see that even with Tyson Fury recently. I don't know if you know who Tyson Fury is, but right, he had this trilogy fight with this other enormously powerful man, right? And at the end, he'll tell you, I went through depression and I was sad and all this, and you hear him saying it, you go, that's great. You could have never said that were you not a world-renowned boxer. That wouldn't have been acceptable from you this man who's 6'9", you know, weighing in at 270 pounds.
Right.
I don't believe that anyway. I don't believe he could have stood up and cried and talked about his feelings were he not a world-renowned boxer.
Sure.
And so these are the rivers, right, that exist in me, and I'm here with a younger man and a senior man who I've known for 35 years, and I love and care for them both enormously, and I'm so happy that the three of us are here today.
Yeah.
And yet there's anxiety about, like, is it going to go well? You know, I invited them here and all this kind of nonsense, you know.
I know.
And I don't care.
Did you ruin their afternoon?
And I'm so happy that they're here with me.
Yeah, yeah.
But to speak to you finally and to wrap up, I know that it's not just because he's 60 years old or whatever. I live that same thing, and I don't know where I learned to not be able to say, you know, I'm really pissed off that I can't find my keys, instead of, you know, I guess that equals keys, you know, whatever. I don't know where I didn't learn to say that. I just know it came with the territory.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is really in here somewhere too.
Sure.
We can't even identify where that didn't come from. And I know that's a double negative, so I hope it makes sense, but that's very perplexing to a thoughtful man
Yeah.
sitting here today
Right.
in 2021.
Right.
And so
Well,
that's,
let me thank you for your comment. You know, it's funny, when we talk all the time about the conversation that you say that you're glad is finally happening, that it's almost impossible to get men into the room for those conversations. Men's work is the same thing. But what we also discover is that when we get men into the room, they talk. Because I think we're in a different place than we were 30 years ago. I think men are closer to a tipping point of being able to say, you know, I actually do have something to say about that. And they do. And that's a very promising thing. But ultimately, if we're going to solve the problem, you know, because shows up in our national politics, it shows up in you know, predatory capitalism and environmental destruction and all, that's what that is, right? It's I have to be so dominant that I have to not care about the people around me, and I have to not care about the outcome of my actions. So if we're going to solve that problem, we have two places to intercede. When boys are young, we can either create a container for them that says express, and we have, you know, my partner Salih Baba and I wrote a book called The Relational Book for Parenting. And it's literally how to teach kids how to teach parents to create that container for kids so those kids can grow, bringing their full selves, you know, beginning to consider things like context, you know, listening with curiosity, holding uncertainty, stay playful, all of these ideas that you can do instead of trying to grip and control and do it right. And in that way, we create a generation of children who have been heard and felt seen and been responding in authentic ways from early on. And they reach a tipping point of being able to create and care for authentic relationships, after which the sort of cartoonish gender binary stereotype that they're being offered by the culture no longer holds any appeal for them. So that's the work. We can do it then, or you can do it with a guy like me at 55 who's still losing his temper and freaking out all the time because he has no real connection to the trauma that informed his entire process of growing up. And I had it. I still have it. I'll probably have it till the day I die. I don't think I'm going to get the work done before I run out of time because it took me so long to get there. And any young man who can get to that work when he's 20 or 30 is going to have a better chance of getting to a place where he's completely at peace. But I'll tell you, right now, today, the grief and the sadness that I feel is about having missed 5 decades because I was so busy proving what I'm actually not. And so in that process, I'll take what I have now, better late than never. But we can either do the work with children when they're young, or we can do the work with guys later in life who have already done harm and damage, and I've done plenty in my life. Any other questions?
The question is addressed to both of you, but clearly, if you talk to psychotherapists, clergy, anybody who is involved with confidential conversations, you're absolutely right, Mark Greene, that we're at a tipping point, because when you have a one-on-one discussion between two men, or even if the therapist is female, there is that willingness to disclose and bear what's going on inside. There's a deep hurt. I'd like for either of you or both of you to address the fact that some women will also fall into that man box.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And they are constrained, of course, because they've got to be tough, they've got to be real, they can't break apart, and that too imprisons. So if you would comment about that, that would be great.
Sure. Mark, you want me to go? You want to go?
I will share, my sister doesn't kill me for doing this, that I've actually, I have a little sister whom I love, who is in oil and gas. And as a result of being a woman in the field in that particular field, she has had to develop the capacity to compete and perform as a man. And I think it's okay for me to say that she would, if she were here, acknowledge that in doing so, it has crippled her. That there are pieces of her personality that are wounded from having to adopt that behavior. And she's better at being a man than most men are. You do not want to be on the opposite side of an argument because she will win. And I don't think that she's particularly happy about that. But it has forced her into that behavior. Yeah.
There's a story that we used to talk about a lot in America. There's, we go through these phases or these themes about what needs to happen. And for a while, there was this story that men need to learn to express emotionally. They need to open up, right? And you had wives saying, my husband never talks about what he's feeling. And then I was talking to men, and they'd say, oh, yeah, I started opening with my wife, and she said, yeah, that's really good. Don't go any further, because I don't want to hear the part that's about fear or uncertainty or grief or any other thing that makes our safety feel unsafe. So we have a process by which both men and women internalize Manbox culture and then enforce it, right? And, there may be imagine a husband and a wife, or a husband and a non-gender binary person, or whatever partnership it is, where the husband says, I think I'm going to get out of this Manbox thing. I'm going to start performing differently at work. And the wife may say, look, we got 3 kids, we got college bills, we got this and that. Those guys are not going to buy into that at work. You're going to put us at risk. So fine, do that at home if you'd like, but don't do that out in the world, because it's not safe. So by the same, in the same way, there may be parents who absolutely understand that dominance-based masculinity and all those limitations of boys are bad for our sons. But they might say to themselves, but I don't want him to be the one who takes the beating. So I got to teach him some of this stuff just to make sure he's okay out there, right? So we have very smart, informed, thoughtful people who still see the overarching structure as a threat if we don't play along to some degree. Mm-hmm. And that's another aspect of this that's really challenging, because it speaks to the question of what is strength and what is power for boys and girls, for non-binary people, for human beings. Is it the ability to model dominance, or is it the ability to form community and connection? I'll tell you straight up, if you look at the health data, it's community and connection, because those other people are dying earlier. They simply are. If a hierarchy of masculinity with white men at the top, if that's the best place to be, why is that particular demographic, why does that demographic have the highest suicide rates? We're talking about a system that's broken top to bottom. And you spoke earlier about our former president. That's not a happy man. I don't see him as happy at all. I see him as doubling down on dominance every single time because that's what he got taught in his trauma-informed life. Mm-hmm. And if that is the mode by which we're expected to be strong, that's not strength at all. That's self-destruction. It's the destruction of your immediate circle. It's the destruction of everyone that you come in contact with. So we need a new definition of strength. And the definition of strength for men and women equally, in equity, is the ability to connect, to create and sustain authentic, meaningful friendships. And lo and behold, that's the key to equity and inclusion in the workplace. It's relationships. You can't have diversity, inclusion, and equity without what happens between individual human beings being authentic and healthy. That's the key, right? That's it. That's why our politics are broken. That's why our systems are in turmoil and struggling. Because the one piece that we're the best at, that Darwin said was the reason our species survived, according to Niobe Way, was our ability to form community. And that's the one thing that our culture and our system is breaking all the time. We get fed binaries 24/7 by the news media. It's a giant machine that's just screaming binaries at us. That women are this and men are that. That the left is this and the right is that. And that people of color are this and white people are that. But it's not that those conversations aren't worth having. It's that it's not about the conversation. It's about getting you in either camp and getting you to fight. Binaries, right? You can only have an overwhelming system that's binary driven if relationships are all broken, if connection is broken. That's how you get a binary system to actually get fueled up and really run as beautifully as ours is. So until we turn our attention to connection, and we have our book, our little book, we have games, we made up games. I'll tell you a story. Do we have time?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll tell you a story about my son. My son was 5 years old, I guess, and I had divorced his mother. That was another marriage that I had failed. I failed 2. I was now in my 3rd relationship with my wife, Saliha. And my wife, Saliha, and I were having a discussion. And Gus said, "Stop fighting." And we looked over, and I realized he had a lot of fear on his face. And for him, oh God, here goes Dad again. Here goes Mom again. This is going to be another divorce. It's going to be another thing, right? Because for him, we were either in a conversation or we were in a fight, one of the two. So I looked at him and I thought, okay, Gus, we're just having a conversation. No, you're having a fight. I said, okay, wait. We're going to do the conversation again, but I want you to tell me something. I got a question for you. We're going to do it again. We'll perform it for you again, and you tell me if it's a conversation, if it's a discussion, if it's a debate, if it's a disagreement, if it's an argument, or if it's a fight. Okay? Discussion, debate, disagreement, argument, or fight. And I turned back to Saliha and I said, we're going to do something different for you. Wait, and we whispered back and forth. Okay, so we're going to have a discussion about dinner, Gus, and you tell us what we're doing, okay? And I looked at Saliha and I said, I want hamburgers. She said, I want pasta. I said, well, I don't want pasta. We had pasta 2 days ago. Oh yeah, well, I think pasta's much healthier than hamburger. I don't think hamburger is healthy. I want hamburgers, okay? Then we turned around and looked at Gus and we said, what was that? Was that a debate, an argument, a fight? What was that? He looked at us and he went, I don't know. I think that was like somewhere between a debate and an argument. Was it a fight? Were we fighting? He said, no, not really, not quite. I said, okay, good. Now you and Saliha do one. And he was like, and he ran over, they had a little discussion, and they had this over-the-top yelling thing about dessert. And I said, yeah, that was definitely a fight. That was totally a fight. And he went, And for the next few weeks, whenever we started to have something going on, I would say, oh, let's play the game. Do it again, and I'll tell you what I think it is. And at some point thereafter, after playing that game for a little while, he no longer had that fear in his eyes when people were having a debate or a discussion or an argument or anything else. It went away because we had a game and we taught him to give us feedback about what he thought he was seeing. We had another game we created with him called the Catch You Doing Something Right game. And we took a piece of poster board and stuck it on the wall and put 3 lines on it. I wrote, Gus, Saliha, Dad. And we got a book of stickers and put it next to it. And I said, now whenever you catch somebody doing something right, this is how the game works. And so it's not right as they do it, but a little bit later, we'd be in the house and Saliha would be doing something at her computer and I'd be doing something in the kitchen and I would turn to Gus and I'd say, caught ya. And he would say, what? Oh, what did I do? I said, I caught you doing something right. He'd say, what was it? And I'd say, I don't know, man, somewhere in the back of the house. It happened earlier. He'd be like, I don't know, man. And he'd start going back and looking around, you know, and I'd say, I think it was in this room, you know, and I'd point in the bathroom and he'd go in there and look around and he'd go, I hung my towel up. And I'd say, yes, you did. I caught you doing something right. And we'd run in there and get a sticker and put it up on the sticker thing, right? Now, we did that regularly because we wanted to change the culture of our family from noticing what needed to be done better to noticing what was happening that was right. But I have to tell you, when your 6-year-old child looks at you and says, aha, caught you, and you don't know what you did right, and then he points it out to you, my son, at 6 years of age, says, caught you. And I said, oh, what did I do? Did I put the dishes away? He goes, no. I said, what did I do? And he said, you don't know? I said, I don't know. Dad, earlier, you were starting to get a little irritated, and I saw you stop yourself. You stopped yourself, Dad. I thought, well, okay, man, get me a sticker. Let's do this thing. And in that moment, I understood that he could see the dynamics between myself and other people in this family just as clearly as an adult could, and that he could acknowledge when someone made an effort to not fall prey to their own limitations or shortcomings or struggles. And that sticker game went on for 3 or 4 years, and those poster boards got so full, and we became a family which noticed what was going right. And I'm going to do one more real quick. This is another game. They're all in the book. This is short. Whenever we were having a debate in our family, Gus was maybe 10, I don't know, we're doing back and forth and arguing and stuff, any person in that discussion, which was perhaps not going as well as it could just switch to barking. And we would look at each other and in that moment, you break the tension of the debate, you take away the words and only do the emotions, and you can just vent those emotions as hard as you want, and by the end of it, everybody does a reset on the argument. Because it's no longer about the argument, it's about how funny it is that we're barking like dogs and acknowledging that this whole argument really isn't what matters to us so darn much. And then we would go back to we'd say, okay, 5 minutes, and then we'd go back to the conversation with a different energy. The ways in which we can grow our relational capacities to care for relationships over roles and tasks and responsibilities is central to the ways in which we empower our children to care for relationships. And as we are shaping them, they are shaping us. The relational wheel, which we have a slide for, I think, shows 6 of these capacities. But ultimately, when we do this work with our children, we do it for ourselves. And we heal a lot of the trauma and damage that we carried in a world where we weren't playful and couldn't do that work.
I've been watching my son over there as you've been saying all this, and I think he might be wishing that we had known each other 20 years ago.
Well, I wish I'd known myself 20 years ago.
So Cecily, I think, has a comment or a question. Is there a mic handy?
Thank you. So, Mark, everything you say is breaking my heart.
Thank you.
I guess because I'm old, and I've been through watching a lot of this kind of thing going on with men for a very long time. On the other hand, I'm also a grandmother of 6. The oldest is 33, male. He recently married. He's been living with his intended, they would have married last year, but for COVID they married this year. So they've been living together, and they interest me greatly, and they give me hope.
Oh, good.
My grandson, the 33-year-old, whose name is Chris, says things like, I'd be happy to be a home husband if that's how it works out. She has an incredible job. She's a trader for Bank of America and cannot work at home. Chris has a wonderful job, and he can work at home. In his office, there's a yoga mat, and he's taken up yoga online, and he has learned to cook. She doesn't like to cook. He's discovered he loves to cook. So he cooks. She gets home later than he does. He starts earlier than she does. I watch them, and their dance is so free. It's so different than anything I've been through.
Yeah.
And I am awed by them.
Yeah.
And I am hopeful.
Yeah.
Chris, they can't afford to belong to some place where you can play tennis, so he goes online and finds people who are signing up for playing tennis on the tennis courts at the high school.
Yeah.
And goes off on Saturday to meet some guy he's never laid eyes on to play tennis with in the town they now live in. So now he knows a bunch of guys that he plays tennis with, whom he never met before. I don't remember anybody doing that. I don't remember that kind of behavior.
Yeah.
He has wonderful friends and lots of them, and he's in contact with them. So something, I've got my fingers crossed big time, something's happening.
It is.
Maybe.
Yes.
It is.
Something's happening maybe. And in our family, I'll just add one more piece. My oldest son is gay. Thank God he lived through the 80s. I was praying every day. He's 63. And he's been, well, in a partnership with a guy. They're married for 30 years. They are in our family the favorite house guests, the favorite uncles. They are the uncles for some reason that my grandchildren think they can talk to best. They're empathic.
Yes.
Now, I'm not suggesting every man be gay, Biden. No, I'm not. Where would that leave us all? On the other hand, they have something that they add to our family dynamic that is utterly special.
Yeah.
And all of my grandkids think of them as their favorite uncles.
That's great.
The most reachable.
Cicely, I think you're making a really important point that we need to stress, and that is that there is hope and there are things that are changing. I think the thing that, that worries me a little bit is that it's still, everybody's going up against the Manbox. And so I'm absolutely convinced that a shift in culture can occur, and it can occur pretty rapidly, but there are some real dynamics, some whatever, what is that, headwinds, tailwinds, I can't remember, that we're flying into, and we just have to keep at it.
I'm absolutely convinced that what you're saying is true. It is true at a personal level, it is true at a social level, cultural level, national level, international level. It's a world problem that you have described, which has twisted my heart in knots.
Oh.
And we must do something about it. But I had to say, in my life right now, and I'm so grateful for it at my age, I see hope.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we all do.
Lisa. Yeah. Lisa.
Yeah.
Just for whatever it's worth, from my perspective, seeing you connect and have your conversation, and when Mark, you expressed that you were uncomfortable, and you said something to the effect of, that was supportive. When you were connecting that way, for me watching, it was joyful. Like, just to observe the fact that you were supporting each other and that you were also both being vulnerable. To me, when I see a man being vulnerable, I think that is the most, the sign of strength, like the ultimate sign of strength. So, and the other thing I just quickly wanted to ask was, I have a son who's 16, And I just want to make sure that I don't do anything to shut him down in any way or to send those messages that are so toxic. And I think maybe the best thing to do is just be curious about what his thoughts are and what his feelings are, and because I'm muddling my way through, like everyone else is, in this kind of culture that sends such mixed and bad messages. So I don't know how you feel about that, just the idea of just how do I make sure he stays in touch with really who he is and his core, as opposed to shutting down.
Well, my understanding is if a child has one person in their life who invites them to connect in a regular way about what is really going on for them, it can be a game changer in terms of counteracting what the larger culture seeks to put in place. So we as parents, we as uncles and aunts, we as scoutmasters and coaches and ministers and whatever our role might be, we have an opportunity with every child in our orbit to see them, to just let them be seen. And Judy Chu says, we have a podcast, Remaking Manhood, Judy Chu, we do an interview with her. She says, young boys especially, they'll show up. They're there, they're joyful, they're ready to connect, they're ready to talk. All you have to do is be present for them. And so you, with your child, and me with mine, I think we're creating a wave of change that's pretty dramatic, because I think generations back, those conversations were not happening. There was no invitation to share what was going on. At least for me as a child, I didn't encounter much of that. So, and this is a radical sea change that's taking place and has been taking place for about 20 years. Stay-at-home dads are another radical departure from the Manbox culture and the stoicism and the quiet man sort of model of masculinity. So there's great hope in terms of what we can do and what's happening, both in terms of for children and for men who are ready to step out of the man box, break out of that man box and connect. And men in crisis can do this work. Any man listening to this conversation, or any person who knows a man who's struggling, the Mankind Project, Every Man, Human, therapists, there are many ways to engage in this work. And it's just a question of making that choice to seek connection with other men who are waiting to help you. We're waiting. We're here. What Mark and I modeled, this is the work of men. To say, I love you, brother, and I get that you've got challenges from a lifetime of being with by this system.
Yeah.
But I love you, and I see who you are, and we can all support each other and make a better world. We can do this for ourselves, for the children in our lives, for the women around us.
Well, and I think that's an important point. I mean, one hopes that we don't leave this mess behind us. I mean, we really do, in this generation, need to try hard to change the culture.
Yep. Most certainly.
So we're at time. Oh, I'm very close to that mic, aren't I? But we have two questions in the chat, and I just want to give people an opportunity who are joining us by Zoom to have their questions heard. So if maybe we could quickly address these. So here's the first question. I'm wondering about church as a place where boys can experience a place of relationality outside the man box and where adult men can too. Do any men in the group have any stories of church as a place of hope and possibility for something counterculture? Whoops, and I lost the end of it. And hopeful.
It's funny, we were talking about this earlier, that since what we're all seeking is connection and community, I think it's entirely possible to find that within a church setting or a spiritual setting. And in fact, that's really what the spiritual center is all about. So yes, I think that it's there in some communities. And I hope that we'll be able to build some men's work here as well.
We're when you spend years of your life trying to understand what masculinity is, what the forces are in play, what the culture of masculinity is doing, you inevitably have to eventually move toward connection. And connection is spiritual. That is, you start to hit this plane where you start having spiritual experiences, a sense of community across difference and across all of the other false narratives that we get caught in. So for young men to find that, there's a man named Ashanti Branch who's working with students out in California. He has a thing called the Million Mask March. There's a guy named Brian Anderson who's running an online community called Fathering Together. He was originally, I believe, a chaplain at a university, did interfaith coordination work. So, but anyway, he's fabulous. We interview him on our podcast. His philosophy of parenting is so ephemeral and beautiful and real at the same time that I can't tell you, go listen to this guy talk. But Fathering Together is a community where men can collectively begin talking to each other about how to do this for our kids. So there's a lot of resources out there in the world, and they're growing all the time because I think men have had their fill of the bullying and the hierarchical masculinity. And so guys are doing stuff all over the place. It's starting to happen everywhere.
Great, thank you. The second question I think we may have addressed. It seems to be from Mark's father, though, Tom Grayson. Since the acceptable behavior among men and women has evolved significantly over 80 to 90 years as we have experienced, how can the new rules be shared effectively with younger generations? And then he said, way to go.
How can the new rules be shared effectively?
Can I address that?
Yeah.
I think what we're really fundamentally talking about here is a narrow, constrained expression of masculinity versus masculinities, a vast range of potential ways to be men, to be non-binary people, to be women, opening it up from conformity, narrow pressure, to the full range so that every human being can find their place on that spectrum that feels natural to them. Included, now if I sit here and say to you, we need a vast range of masculinities, but not traditional masculinity because we don't like that one. That would be hypocritical, right? That would be antithetical to my belief, which is that all masculinities are equally valid. So understand that the Manbox culture isn't about traditional masculinity, it's about the enforcement of it, that as the only way. On that spectrum, for some men, that's a good fit. So we're not teaching a new set of rules. We're saying, can we please take the freaking rules out of this and instead co-create in collaboration with the people in our lives a version of being human that fits for us as individuals. When I talk about remaking manhood, I'm not saying take this manhood and make it that one. I'm saying each human being who happens to be male identifying can design their own way of being without taking heat from the men around them or from the women around them or from whoever might choose to critique that. And instead, we have a culture of masculinity which is like, these are all equally valid. These are all equally valid expressions. And we love you for what is coming to you in your own development as a human being.
Beautiful.
There it is, I hope.
So we're going to have to wrap up. Thank you, everyone. Great discussion. Yeah. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah. And we're going to have a continuing conversation about this with Mark throughout the rest of the year. And for everybody who's watching, we have an event on November 6th. Sadhvi Bhagawati Saraswati has agreed to a second visit from India, live, 9 a.m. in the morning. So mark your calendars for that. And be well. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
It's nice.